Good morning, everybody. My name is Kenneth Roth, and I am the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. And it's my pleasure this morning to present Human Rights Watch's annual World Report, a 676-page volume covering human rights developments in more than 90 countries around the world. We issue this report each year to highlight the most important trends, not only in each of these countries, but also globally. And the introductory essay to the report traditionally highlights a theme or development of global significance. And this year we chose to focus on the international reaction to the Arab Spring. And it's for that reason, as Nadi mentioned, that we are releasing this report for the first time here in Cairo. What I'd like to do with my opening remarks is to outline some of our principal findings, and then I would welcome your questions, not only about the report, but also we'd be happy to take questions about the recent developments here in Egypt, the meeting of the Arab League today with respect to Syria, or anything else on your mind. We really would be happy to discuss any country in the world. Now, in the introductory essay, we reach the sad but unavoidable conclusion that Western policy toward the Arab world traditionally has been one of containment. That is, it treated the Arab people as if they were to be feared. Elsewhere around the world, the West often promoted democracy. But in the Middle East and North Africa, the West seemed content to back an array of autocrats, so long as they, in turn, supported Western interests. The West basically looked to the monarchs and the strong men of the Arab world to guarantee so-called stability, that is, to keep the lid on popular demands. And this acceptance of authoritarianism was seen as the best way to pursue a series of perceived Western interests, whether that was limiting political Islam, combating terrorism, protecting Israel, maintaining the flow of oil, or stemming migration to Europe. As a result of this policy, the West's promotion of human rights had what we call an embarrassing Arab exception. Now, the Arab people have shown through the uprisings of the last year that they clearly do not share the West's comfortable complacency with autocratic rule. And the West, frankly, is still adjusting to this historic transformation. In the past year, the West has generally opposed the violent suppression of peaceful demonstrators, but the West has frankly been sometimes reluctant to become genuinely full partners with the protesters. And so you've seen the US government, clinging to President Mubarak until his fate was virtually sealed. You saw France doing roughly the same thing with Tunisia's President Ben Ali. Even today, the West has tacitly endorsed an amnesty for Yemen's President Saleh, sending a message to his government that it will pay no price for continuing to kill demonstrators. Similarly, the West has condemned Bahrain's suppression of its democracy movement, but it has applied no real pressure on Bahrain to reform. And as for the remainder of the monarchs in the region, they have come under virtually no serious pressure to democratize. But frankly, the worst response to the Arab Spring has not been from the Western democracies, it's been from the dictatorial governments of the world, who these days seem to be living in fear of the precedent set in this region of people who are willing to take to the streets to seek their freedom. China, for example, has greatly deepened its repression in an effort to avoid the so-called Jasmine rallies that were modeled after Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution. Similarly, in countries as diverse as Zimbabwe, Iran, Sudan, Uzbekistan, Cuba, Ethiopia, and Vietnam, autocrats are doing everything they can to suppress the kind of popular power demonstrated by the Arab Spring. Now, more disappointing, you might say, because we would have hoped for better, has been the response of some of the leading democracies of the global South, places like Brazil, India, and South Africa, all of whom held critical seats on the UN Security Council during the year 2011. Despite themselves having developed accountable governments and the rule of law, despite themselves historically having benefited from a global effort to promote human rights in their countries, these southern democracies frankly showed only sporadic interest in helping the people of the Arab world. Instead of using their influence in a sustained and consistent pattern to stop repression, these southern democracies seemed much more preoccupied with fear that the promotion of human rights, the pressure on the autocrats, would somehow serve northern interests rather than obviously serving the interests of the people of this region. China and Russia have been the most obstructionistic in actually vetoing efforts at the UN Security Council to put pressure on Syria's Assad. Their ostensible reason of avoiding another military intervention as occurred in Libya rings hollow when the modest resolution that they vetoed is looked at, a resolution that could not possibly have been read to authorize military action. Now, one non-Western democracy, Turkey, has played an increasingly important role in the region, regularly speaking out against the violence and the autocracy. But its ability to serve as a positive example has been undermined by a growing intolerance of dissent at home, and the continued suppression of journalists and of peaceful Kurdish activists. Now, as for the Arab League, it's been much more involved than ever before in trying to stop the bloodshed, at least in Libya and Syria. The challenge today, as the Arab League meets, is to prevent President Assad from using its involvement, the Arab League's involvement, to deflect pressure from Syria to reform and to stop the killing. And so the real challenge for the Arab League today is to work out some way for it not simply to be sending observers in, but to maximize the ability of those observers to put pressure on Assad to stop the killings. We have specific recommendations, which I'd be happy to talk about in greater detail during the question and answer period. Now, the African Union, it's worth noting, has done nothing to stand up for the people of Northern Africa. The African Union was founded to promote democracy, but in this last year, it has acted much more as if it is a dictator's support club, backing whatever authoritarian happens to be in power and utterly ignoring the democratic interests of the people of North Africa. In releasing this report today, Human Rights Watch calls for an end to this indifference from many quarters to the rights of the people of the Middle East and North Africa. We recognize that the revolutions in this region have been driven foremost by the people of this region. But nonetheless, we believe that the international community is capable of, at least theoretically, playing a very important supportive role. And thus, we call on the international community to adopt a much more principled approach to the region than it has in the past. In essence, to end the Arab exception to the promotion of democracy. That's going to require, to begin with, clearly siding with the democratic reformers, even at the expense of abandoning autocratic friends. There's no excuse for any government to tolerate Assad's lethal repression, to close its eyes to Bahrain's continuing systematic crackdown, or to exempt the other monarchs of the region from serious pressure to reform. All autocrats, regardless of how friendly they are to the West, should be dissuaded from using repression to defend their power and their privilege. This kind of principled support for the protesters can also positively influence the outlook of the new governments that are taking power, including here in Egypt, to help them steer clear of the intolerance, the lawlessness, and the summary revenge that are a risk in any revolution, and to encourage them to respect the full panoply of rights, including the rights of minorities, whether political, religious, ethnic, or social. Now, in particular, Human Rights Watch calls on the international community to take 4 steps. First, we ask the international community to come to terms with political Islam when it represents a majority preference. Islamist parties have proven to be genuinely popular in the Arab world. Ignoring that popularity would violate democratic principles. Rather, we urge that wherever an Islamic-inspired government emerges, the international community should focus on encouraging and, if need be, pressuring the new government to respect basic rights, just as the Christian-labeled parties in the governments of Europe are also expected to do. Being a politically Islamic government should not be a reason to turn a government into a pariah, which is the way the West in the past has responded in places like Algeria or the Palestinian territories. Second, we stress that the right to freedom of expression requires consistent defense. The Arab revolutions have become possible only because civil society was able to organize itself and, using the internet and satellite TV, build public outrage over authoritarian rule by circumventing the state's efforts to maintain a monopoly over the public dissemination of information. Just as NGOs and civil society must continue to be nurtured, not investigated or persecuted, so this key medium of communication, social media and the internet, needs a strong defense, even when its message might be seen as anti-Western. We note that social media has become particularly important as a battlefield as governments try to censor and monitor its users. We note that strong global standards are needed to protect freedom on the internet, as well as the privacy of internet users. International companies should also be prevented from selling equipment or know-how to governments that use the internet to spy on or repress their people. Now, the third thing we ask is that the international community must help fight the tendency of authoritarian governments to resort to torture, an all too common practice in this part of the world. But that means that the West must come clean about its own complicity in torture, often used as a tool in fighting terrorism. The West must investigate and punish its own people who ordered or were complicit in the use of torture, something that the Obama administration has completely refused to do, and European governments have done it sporadically at best. The West must also stop finding excuses to send terrorist suspects to governments in this region that continue to systematically torture, and stop using agreements among diplomats as fig leaves to justify handing people over to be tortured. Finally, the international community must help build the rule of law in this region. And that means by opposing the impunity that encourages repression and atrocities. It's all too tempting to try to sweep under the rug the atrocities of autocratic allies. That's often done in the name of facilitating a transition. We're seeing this today in Yemen. The lesson we've learned, though, particularly out of Yemen, is that when you send a signal that there is no price to be paid for killing demonstrators, you basically give a license to kill. You send the signal that the government can kill as many demonstrators as it wants. If it succeeds in staying in power, it obviously won't prosecute itself. But if it loses power, there will be no consequences to be borne. That is a terrible signal. It encourages violence rather than promotes an end to violence. So in conclusion, let me say that the uprisings and revolutions of this past year clearly present an enormous opportunity for the human rights cause. Yet given the violent forces that continue to resist progress here, it's wrong to simply leave to the Arab world the task of facing the people with the guns. International help is needed. And to date, the international community, as I've outlined, has been much too equivocal and inconsistent in assisting the birth of rights-respecting democracies in this region. Ultimately, the international community has to decide what it stands for. Does it value the rights and the aspirations of the people of this region, or does it prefer to side with the autocrats? We hope that it makes the right decision. Thank you very much, and we would welcome your questions.